Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography in the Kingfisher blind this morning. And I'm shooting the Canon R7 this morning with the 100 to 500 on it. And over the past month or so, I've been shooting the R3, then the R5, now the R7 here in the Kingfisher blind. And this upcoming video is going to be all about the pros and cons of those three cameras for shooting a very fast, I think difficult bird and flight subject against dirty backgrounds. And we'll talk about autofocus performance, image quality, all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested, stay tuned. All right, so as you heard in the intro, we're talking about the Canon R7, the Canon R5, and the Canon R3. Overall performance, in a sense, really autofocus performance. Overall image quality, having a lot to do with ISO performance. And some other issues that have popped up when we're talking about shooting high-speed flying birds, small, fast-flying birds. Now, I spent the last month shooting all three of these bodies in my Kingfisher blind, from my Kingfisher blind. And, of course, diving kingfishers are small, fast, flying birds. And let me just preface this video with the fact that all three of these cameras are great cameras. They take very high quality image. They take very high quality images. Image quality, colors are great, all three bodies. Autofocus performance is amazing, especially this little body, the R7, the R3. They have the same autofocus system. We'll get into that. The R5 autofocus system is different, but still very good. So anyway, this video is about, I think, a demanding kind of shooting scenario and which camera performed the best overall, which one I would go to when I'm shooting in a scenario such as the Kingfisher. So this video is kind of a niche thing, but we as bird photographers, we get into situations where we're shooting small, fast-flying birds, and I want to know which one to go to, which one I would get if that's what I do a lot of, and I do mostly birds in flight. So anyway, I wanted to preface this, though, with the fact that for most scenarios, all of these cameras will do just fine. They're great cameras. So pick the one that fits your needs in general the best. If you're shooting really fast action, there's some differences here that I think are important to point out, and that's what this video is about. So let's start out by talking about the autofocus performance of these three cameras. I just kind of talked about that a little bit just a minute ago. I'm going to start out with the R3 and the R7 because they do have the same autofocus system and the same flexibility in that system then, versus the R5, which has a less flexible autofocus system. Less capable too, kind of. What I found is that the R3 and the R7, their autofocus system, when you're talking about a diving kingfisher or a kingfisher flying by really fast, it takes about a second for the kingfisher to dive from its perch down to the water, hopefully catch a fish and get back to the perch. It's like a second or two. It's really fast. And the autofocus system on the R3 and the R7 are better than the R5. The performance is better. Now, let me tell you how I set up my autofocus system for this. I'm not using eye detection. I'm using a straight zone. Why don't I use eye detection? Well, because a lot of times the kingfisher's eye, even though they have a big eye, it's not visible a lot of the time because the bird's diving, sometimes away, hitting the water, turning around, coming back, hitting the water, the bird's underwater, the eye disappears. When the bird comes out of the water, you have all the splash, all the droplets of water look like it. There's a lot of distraction there for eye detection. I find and have found that a straight zone, a square zone, a relatively square zone toward the center of the frame, a little bit bigger than the bird with its wings spread out, is the way to go. So that's the way I've had my autofocus system set up for all three of these cameras during the month that I've been shooting all three of these cameras for the kingfisher. The zone on the R3 and the R5 and the R7, get confused here, is more flexible because you can change the size of the zones. And that's critical, I think, for something like this because I can make the zone the exact size I want, give me a little fudge factor in there for not being able to pan perfectly with a bird going so fast, but yet it's small enough to take out a lot of the distracting background. I can set the zone size, and once I do that, the zone picks up the bird's movement, picks up the bird's features. The autofocus on all the cameras was still set for a subject detection tracking, with animals, of course, being the subject. Eye detection turned off. On the R5, I was relegated to a smaller square in the center of the frame because the R5 doesn't have the ability to change the size of the zones. And I think that hurt a little bit. And also, it just didn't seem to pick up on the bird as well as the autofocus systems in the R3 and the R7. So that's the setup of the autofocus, and I found that the R7 and the R3's autofocus in general did a little bit better job than the R5. What about light levels and autofocus performance? They all did about the same, but again, the R7, the R3 and the R7 did a little bit better, even in lower light. And when the bird first gets to the perch in the morning, it's still pretty darn dark. He's an early riser, and he gets there, and I like to shoot for blur shots when it's early, shooting 1/80th of a second, down and back, wings blurred, everything blurred, trying to get the head sharp. So autofocus still needs to perform. The R3 and the R7 did a little bit better than the R5. R5 still does okay. It's just that the R3 and the R7's autofocus system is just a notch better than the R5 for this shooting scenario. Okay, not much else to say about autofocus. Image quality overall, ISO performance. There's going to be a little bit of a caveat here toward the end of this section, but we'll talk about it in a pure sense. And I'll show some images here. I'm showing some images. Unprocessed. I don't shoot really high ISOs, even when it's relatively dark. Because when it's relatively dark, like I said, I'm going for blur shots, so I can keep my shutter speeds really low. So I don't need high ISOs to get enough light. Also, for perch shots, when the bird does bring a fish back out and the bird lands on the perch, with or without a fish, hopefully with a fish. With these cameras now, and I'm going to tell you another thing about my setup right now, I shot exclusively electronic shutter with these cameras, no mechanical shutter. Why? This is why. Because I can shoot really slow shutter speeds with all three of these cameras, keeping the ISOs relatively low, 1/30th of a second on a perched kingfisher with a fish, getting sharp shots because the electronic shutter imparts no shutter shock, no shake to the camera, Shooting from a tripod, have to, in the Kingfisher blind. So that's what these electronic shutters nowadays, it's one of the things they let you do that you couldn't do before. You can shoot at much slower shutter speeds at 20 frames per second. You're not going to get 20 or 30 frames per second if you're set at 1/30th of a second, but you're still shooting at fairly fast frames per second. You can catch the bird when it's totally still. You're on a tripod, no shutter shock because you're shooting electronic shutter. So there you go. That's the way I was shooting early or in low light if it was foggy or cloudy that morning. You can shoot at lower shutter speeds and still get tack sharp images and thus keep your ISOs down. So there's no need to be shooting in that 10,000 ISO, something like that. I think the highest ISOs I was shooting was about 5,000, 4,000, somewhere in there. Highest ISOs I was shooting. All three of these cameras, even the crop sensor camera, the R7, did really well in those ISO ranges. Was there more noise in the crop sensor than in the 30 plus megapixels here, 40 plus megapixels here, 20 plus megapixels here? Okay, different resolutions too. A medium resolution, 30 plus megapixels here on a crop sensor, yes, there was more noise, but it wasn't unbelievably bad at those ISO levels. The R5, higher resolution, more noise than the R3 at comparable ISOs, yes, but not bad. The R3, unbelievably good at even ISO 10,000, but we're not going there here. So really, image quality is not something to worry about at reasonably high ISOs, even cropping in, because we're cropping on this bird when we're doing post-processing most of the time because he isn't really big. Shooting 600 millimeters on the R5 for the most part, and the R3, not putting 600 f4 on the R7. This is a crop sensor. I don't want 900 millimeters of range, of focal length. I'm shooting the 100 to 500 on the R7 so that I can pull back, shooting it at about 400 millimeters, which gives me about 640 millimeters or so of focal length, somewhat comparable to the 600 on these two cameras, the full frame cameras. The caveat that I mentioned that I want to talk about now is that there are post-production processes now, like topaz denoise, like DxO, pure raw, that can deal with noise better than we have ever seen before. And so even if you see, and you will see, levels of noise in the R7, and maybe even the R5 a little bit, I don't even really have to worry about it in the R3, that more than you can handle, more than you'd like to see in your images, you can now remove it almost completely from your images using these denoising algorithms now, these artificial intelligence denoising programs, DxO, Pure Raw, Topaz Denoise. They're unbelievably good. I may do a video on my post-processing workflow has been evolving just about every day now, it seems, because of these programs and their updates and stuff like that. Sometimes I've been messing around with a combination of DxO Pure Raw and Topaz Denoise in some of my shots just to see what you could do with them. It's pretty amazing what you can do now with noise. So again, yes, there's some differences here, but if you keep your relative head about you when you're shooting and setting your ISOs and understand that you can shoot at slower shutter speeds with electronic shutters now and still get sharp shots, which I'm trying to portray here with the images I'm showing, and I'll put images up and have a link in the description of this video to where you can go see these images at your leisure. You know, as long as you stay in a reasonable range of ISO and consider what you can do with slower shutter speed so you don't have to make your ISOs or set your ISOs so high, there's really not much of a difference in these cameras. Nothing that would keep me from shooting any one of them for a scenario like the Kingfisher diving. So, where are we with this video then? Well, this is where the next topic, and this is image quality in a way, but it's more about rolling shutter with these cameras. For the most part, there's rolling shutter in all cameras, all mirrorless cameras. If you shoot mechanical shutter, you don't have to worry about rolling shutter. But I was shooting exclusively electronic shutter. Why do that? Well, I already talked about, for one reason, is shutter shock and being able to shoot slower shutter speeds and not having the vibration from the shutter. The other reason is I want full frames per second from these cameras when I can get them. 30 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 20 frames per second, because this bird is fast. Like I said, just a second or two to go down and back up to the perch. I want every frame I can get in there. Because if he loses control of the fish on the way up, I want 20, 30 frames per second rolling off, because I want to get as many frames in there as I can, get that perfect shot of him recapturing the fish in midair and stuff like that. Frames per second matters to me, so I'm shooting an electronic shutter. Now, you know, the difference between 20 and 30 frames per second, it's there, yes, between these cameras. 20 here, like I said, on the R5. But it's still, that's what I want, so that's another reason for shooting electronic shutter. But with electronic shutter comes rolling shutter, and every electronic shutter mirrorless camera has rolling shutter to a certain extent. Whether you can really see it or not in your images is another question, or another thing entirely. The R3, you really don't see it much at all. The R5, you can see it in background elements when you're panning really fast with a flying bird. They're going to be slanted a little bit. But there's another issue with the R5 and rolling shutter, or read speeds of the data coming off the sensor, which is a part of rolling shutter, that leaves an artifact in certain images with small birds flying quickly. And it's not so much the bird flying quickly, but it's the movement of the wings. If you capture frames where the wing tips are moving really fast, power stroke down or up, you're going to see some anomalies in there, some artifacts of this read speed problem, a slow read speed in general, of the 45 megapixels of this camera, the R5, where you're going to see horizontal barring in the wingtips of, in this case, my Kingfishers. Wow, I don't like it. It ruins those images. It's not all the images, it's very few of the images, but it's the ones where the bird is making really radical movements, really fast bursts of speed and things like that, take off, where the wingtips are moving really fast, that you get this barring, and you can see it in some images here, and those images are ruined, in my view. In my opinion, they're no good. When the Kingfisher is doing radical movements is when he loses a fish. Like I said, the images I really want, mid-air recapture of fish. Sometimes that creates, makes the bird do some pretty radical stuff with its wings, fast wingtip speeds. You get that barring. I don't want to lose those images to an artifact that this camera, the R5, produces in those scenarios or in those situations. That makes me not want to shoot the R5, even though I like the resolution at 45 millimeters for the Kingfisher. R3, you don't get any artifacts at all. Very little rolling shutter or read speed artifacts, or whatever you want to call them, in any images, even the fastest movements of the Kingfisher, the R3. So it makes me want to shoot the R3. And the autofocus is unbelievably good, like I said earlier, in the R3. So it makes me want to shoot the R3 for my Kingfisher work. 24 megapixels sometimes, I wish there was more there. But the 24 megapixels of the R3 are very high quality megapixels and very high quality pixels overall. What I'm saying is the images look nice, okay? They look really, really good. So far my choice for shooting the Kingfisher, the R3. Now let's get to the R7. I already said that the autofocus system is just as good as the R3's. It really is. I've been shooting these things side by side. I don't notice a difference. A real difference? No, I don't. It's really good. It's just as flexible. What's the problem with the R7 at 30 plus megapixels, shooting 30 frames per second? 30 frames per second, 20 frames per second. Pretty decent buffer here. Great buffer here. Great speed of downloading, dumping your buffer to the card because this has Compact Flash Express cards. This doesn't. Therein lies the problem. One of the problems with shooting the R7 for the Kingfisher is that at 30 plus megapixels, shooting C-RAW now, not full RAW, so the file sizes are smaller, but at 30 frames per second, getting the full frames per second, equivalent to this camera, the R3, you get no buffer. I mean, it's like zit, and it's full. And when the buffer's full, it's full and it stops shooting, period. And dump of the buffer to the SD cards in this camera is not really fast. So the problem with this camera, one of them, is that the 30 frames per second, you can't use it for Kingfisher because I follow the bird down to the water and back up. And if I'm shooting 30 frames, I run out of buffer before the bird gets back to the perch. That's no good, especially if he loses the fish in midair. I run out of buffer and I don't get the shots. Those are the shots I want. No good. Now, we're still talking about the rolling shutter thing here, too. On here, you don't get the barring of the wingtips when they're moving really, really fast. What you get is what I would call true rolling shutter artifacts, where things are distorted in the wingtips, not in the bird. If you're panning accurately with the bird, you don't get any weird looks in the bird's body, head. But the wingtips, if they're moving really fast, distortions are there. You can see them in the images I'm showing here. The distortions are there. Makes me not want to shoot the R7 for the Kingfisher. So, two problems with the R7. $1,500 body, $6,000 body, I get it. Can you shoot the R7 for the Kingfisher and get good shots? Sure. Here, look at them. They're beautiful. But there's going to be more times when the R7 causes me problems with the Kingfisher shooting scenario, losing the ability to shoot because the buffer fills. Okay, you can go to a lower frames per second. You can drop down from 30 frames per second on the electronic shutter and shoot a slower frames per second, and that helps with the buffer, but still not enough for me, really. The rolling shutter on the wingtips, there's going to be a few shots when the wingtips are really moving fast where you're not going to get a good quality shot, I would call it, because of distortion. And you've got a higher resolution at 30 plus megapixels versus 20 plus megapixels here on the R3. So here, that lays it out. The two cameras that I'm going to use, that I use now that I've done all three with the Kingfisher, the R3 first, because there's really no drawback to shooting the R3 other than resolution, which I can deal with because I'm only 18 feet away from the perch with this bird. So I don't need to crop in a lot. The R3 is the way to go. My second choice, not the R5, the R7, because of the autofocus system being so much better than the R5. It's not so much better, but it's so much better, another notch or so. And the horizontal barring on the R5 and the poor autofocus performance, that's just a no-go for me with the R5. So to me, shoot the R3, backup body, the R7, and there you have it. That's kind of what's going on with these three cameras in a shooting scenario of a relatively small bird. Fast moving, fast action is what we're trying to capture. From this point on with the Kingfishers, I'm shooting the R3 this year. That's it. Backup body will be the R7, probably set up actually for video. So anyway, that's where I'm at with my Kingfisher shooting and which of these three camera bodies I'm going to use as my primary and my secondary, and an overall look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of these three cameras for what consider to be a fast kind of subject that's difficult to shoot. Sometimes backgrounds are dirty, right? This isn't blue sky backgrounds. There's stuff in the background. So a rather demanding scenario here, and what camera I would choose and why. So I hope you found this somewhat educational. I didn't go into any setup stuff in here except saying kind of how I had things set up in general and what lenses I used. If you want more information on how I set up these different cameras for bird photography, birds in flight really specifically. I've got other videos that you can choose from on my YouTube channel, so go ahead and view those. If you haven't subscribed to my channel and you like the content on my channel, please do subscribe, because I always love getting new subscribers. So until next time, be safe out there. I hope you have great light. I hope you get great images, and I'll see you soon.